Hi, I'm Belinda Carli, the Director of the Institute of Personal Care Science, and I get asked a lot of little questions about cosmetic acids. So I thought I'd summarise them into a video for you. Now I'm going to have some handy information summarised for you as part of this video that you can get from us absolutely free. Just contact us, info@personalcarescience.com.au, and we can give you the summary sheet that goes along with this video. Now, one of the first things you need to remember with your cosmetic acids is, and definitely today I'm going to be focusing more on the types of acids that provide the exfoliating effect for the skin, but acids really come down to a carboxylic acid functional group. So you might also see other materials that have acid on the end of it that don't have these exfoliating effects, and that's simply because their structure has this carboxylic acid group. For example, things like your citric acid or even things like stearic acid, which is an emulsifier, are called acid because they have this functional group, but they don't all have these exfoliating benefits. So let's look at the really popular ones, and in this video you'll be pleased to know I'm going to be looking at all your alpha hydroxy acids like glycolic acid, lactic acid, mandelic acid, and then I'm going to be looking at your beta hydroxy acid like salicylic acid. I'm also going to have a look at your polyhydroxy acids such as gluconolactone, lactobionic acid, maltobionic acid, and then I'm going to look at other common acids such as azelaic acid, ferulic acid, kojic acid, and tranexamic acid, as well as some of their key derivatives. So first, let's take a look at the alpha hydroxy acids. These are definitely the most potent keratolytic agents. Now, first of all, I do want to warn you about your alpha hydroxy acids. Because of their potency, they can be quite irritating to some users. And there are also some strict regulatory limits about the use of either individual alpha hydroxy acids as well as alpha hydroxy acids combined totals within formulas as well. So you'll need to check your local regulatory limits. Regardless of what I have in this video, they can change at any time, and you'll need to double check those regulatory limits to make sure you comply, particularly with the use of alpha hydroxy acids. So the first and most popular is glycolic acid. Now this has a very low molecular weight, so it has really good penetration into the epidermis, and it has a very strong keratolytic effect in that it helps remove the outer layer of skin cells for a very strong exfoliating effect. Obviously, because of its small molecular weight and its powerful action, it can also be quite irritating to the skin. You will need to check your local regulatory limits about input. I'm not going to provide one on this particular material in the video because it can change, and it does tend to change over time to help protect consumer safety. Just remember that when you're putting it into a formula, it tends to need a pH below 3.85 to have at least 50% bioavailability. And this is an important point early in the video to make sure you understand where a low pH is required for your acid. It will generally pull the acidity or pH of your formula down, which can impact the stability of your formula. And there is absolutely no point in taking the pH back up, to example around a skin compatible pH of 5 or 5.5, because in doing so you actually neutralize your acid. You turn it into a salt and remove all of its efficacy benefits. So in other words, there's no point putting a huge amount of an acid into your formula and then neutralizing it to make it more pH compatible, because you might as well not add the acid in the first place. So just bear that in mind. Where an acid requires a low pH, don't neutralize it or over neutralize it unless you absolutely have to for regulatory purposes, and in which case probably add less acid to begin with so that you don't have to over neutralize it. Otherwise you're just turning it into salt and it's providing no benefit anyway. So just bear that in mind with all of the acids that I present where a low pH is required. Another really common alpha hydroxy acid is lactic acid. Now it has a slightly larger molecular weight than glycolic acid, so it's not as irritating, but it is still an alpha hydroxy acid with a very effective exfoliating effect. Again, I'm not going to give you an input because it does vary by country, so you will need to check your local country regulations to make sure that you're staying compliant with the use of this material. Again, it needs a pH below 3.85 to be 50% bioavailable. So again, where you pull that pH back up after addition, you might as well not add it in the first place, or definitely not add too much such that you have to pull the pH up a lot higher. You really need that pH to be around 3.5 to get the full benefits of these materials. Another alpha hydroxy acid that is becoming more and more popular is mandelic acid. Now again, this is less irritating than the two that I've already mentioned, Again, I'm not going to give you an input simply because you'll need to check your local regulations. This particular material is very, very effective on pigmented skin and particularly darker or African Caribbean skin tones. There's a lot of clinical efficacy data to show that this particular acid is very effective on naturally darker skin without a lot of the irritations that you'll get from one of the other aforementioned acids. Now, it's at this point that you might be wondering, well, can I combine different acids in the formula? I would advise against that, or consider why you want to do that. For example, why would you want several different types of alpha hydroxy acids in your formula, particularly because they are so strictly regulated by regulatory limits? I would recommend the use of one alpha hydroxy acid in your formula, or you may want to combine with a beta hydroxy or polyhydroxy acid for other performance and low irritancy benefits. But I'd really recommend sticking to one type of alpha hydroxy acid that's going to perform the way you need it to, or best suit your consumer group. So in this example, if you were formulating a whitening or exfoliating product for African Caribbean skin tones, Mandelic acid would definitely be my ingredient of choice. I have a video where I show you how to create a Mandelic acid product, so please watch that after this video if you're looking for some formulation inspiration. Now, Mandelic acid is not the easiest to dissolve straight into water. Lactic acid and glycolic acid will go straight into water very easily. But your Mandelic acid you will need to first dissolve in either ethanol or isopropyl alcohol, and your final pH of your product should be around 3.5 to be effective. Remember, check your local country regulations to make sure that that is permitted, and also stick within the limits required for your cosmetic products. Now let's take a look at a beta hydroxy acid, and that is salicylic acid. Definitely one of your very popular acid types to use in a formula, and that's because it has some fantastic keratolytic benefits. It's also antibacterial and has some great anti-acne benefits, and doesn't have the type of irritation that a lot of your alpha hydroxy acids have. But again, very strict regulations over its input in your formulas, and in fact, from a cosmetic chemist perspective, it is really difficult to stabilize, add and stabilize this ingredient into your formula much above 2%, even if that is permitted. You can't just drop your salicylic acid into the water phase of your formula, it will recrystallize out. So you need to mix it first in some ethanol, isopropyl alcohol, some propylene glycol, or propane diol. Now, I have a video on how to add salicylic acid into your formulation, so please have a look at that. And I also have some videos using salicylic acid to make some exfoliating products. Now, this material needs a very acidic pH to be bioavailable, around 3 to be 50% bioavailable. So definitely do not increase the pH of your final product above 3.5. Try and keep it as low as possible, around pH of 3, for the best efficacy and performance of this material. But again, check your local country regulations, because in some regions that low pH with this material or with other materials is not permitted. You will also need to dissolve it in those solvents at a 10:1 ratio. So you'll need to dissolve the salicylic acid in the solvents first, then add it to your formula, and ensure you keep that pH nice and low, otherwise it could recrystallize out over time, and in any case simply won't perform once that pH gets above 4. Now let's talk about polyhydroxy acids, and as the name suggests, it's many repeating units. So these are in general larger molecular weight acids, which means they are inherently far less irritating than the smaller substances I've just been talking about. There's not a lot of regulatory limits over these materials at this point in time, but definitely check with your local regulations anytime you use a cosmetic acid, because new regulations can and do get updated from time to time to help ensure consumer safety. The first material I'm going to go through is Gluconolactone. Now, this again has great exfoliating benefits, and it's great for sensitive skin. You would typically use it between 0.5 to 5% depending on the type of effect you want in your formulation. It's readily water soluble, so it will go into your formula easy, but it does need quite a low pH for its true exfoliating benefits, around a pH of 3. So again, if you're going to add it to your formula for its exfoliating and humectancy benefits, you'll need to add it at this lower pH. Now, gluconolactone is also present as part of a preservative system, but just note when it's part of that preservative system, you would generally take the pH up a bit higher, and it wouldn't have its exfoliating benefits anymore. It also needs a sodium citrate buffer to be stable in your final formula when you're using it as part of a preservative system. Otherwise, it will pull the pH of your formula down over time, which can have big stability impacts. The next polyhydroxy acid I want to introduce you to is Lactobionic acid. Now, this is absolutely fantastic at collagen and skin repair. It promotes wound healing and collagen synthesis, so it's absolutely fantastic in anti-aging products. For regular use products, you would use between 0.5 to 2%, and for high performance products from 2 to 5%. There's currently no regulatory restrictions about its input, but please check with your local country regulations before using in your finished product. It also needs a really low pH to be bioavailable, around a pH of 3. So just keep this in mind when formulating with this material, but it does have some fantastic anti-aging collagen boosting benefits. Then there is Maltobionic acid. This is another fantastic anti-aging acid material. It's fantastic on fine lines and wrinkles. It again has those collagen boosting benefits as well as antioxidant and moisturizing benefits. Regular use would be between 0.5 to 6%, while high use would be 6 to 10%. It's easy to add into your formula, it's very water soluble, and your final pH should be around 4. The next acid I want to introduce you to doesn't come under the alpha hydroxy, beta hydroxy, or even polyhydroxy family. It is azelaic acid. Now, this one does have some regulatory restrictions in Australia in particular, and in other regions around the world there is no restrictions at this point in time. But again, with all of your acids, please do check because those regulations can change. Now, this particular acid is fantastic as an anti-inflammatory, and it's great with rosacea and acne. It's also great with your acne scarring, so it's fantastic to use in those applications if you're permitted to use it in your local region. You would typically use it at 5% for these benefits, and the final pH should be about 3.8 to 4. But just be careful, it's very hard to get into your formulation, so you would generally need to dilute it in a 10:1 ratio in ethanol before adding it to your formulation. And again, remember to keep that pH quite low for stability and efficacy purposes. Now, there is also a really important derivative of azelaic acid, and that is potassium azelaic diglycinate. Now, this is less potentially irritating than the azelaic acid, but it's great for sebum control. Now, again, there are regulatory restrictions in Australia. You'll need to keep it below 1%. In other regions of the world, you can use it from 2 to 8%, but check your local country regulations specific to this material. Potassium azelaic glycinate is not only sebum regulating, but also effective as a whitening agent. So it has some extra benefits if that's what you're looking for in your product. It's readily water soluble, but your final pH must be greater than 5 to ensure it remains stable and efficacious in your finished product. Next is ferulic acid. Now, this is absolutely fantastic in all of your after sun care products. It's got fantastic antioxidant and sun repair / protective benefits in your formulations. So all of your after sun care could benefit from the use of ferulic acid. It would regularly be used between 0.1 to 0.5%, and high use would be considered between 0.5 to 3%. There are currently no regulatory restrictions over this material, but again, remember to check your local country regulations before using in your formulation. Now, you do need to dissolve this material in ethanol, propylene glycol, or propanediol before using, generally in a 10:1 ratio. And your final pH should be around 3.5 to ensure stability and efficacy of this ingredient. The next acid I'm going to talk about is one you've probably also heard of as well, and that is Kojic acid. Now, this is a really effective skin whitening agent, but it can also be very irritating. It can also be overused and cause skin bleaching. So please keep in mind that this ingredient is great when used in its right proportions and permitted by local country regulations, but too much is not a good thing. You would generally use it between 0.5 and 2%, but again, check your local country regulations, as some countries will not permit it in cosmetic products. While it is very effective as a whitening agent, even on age spots, you do need to be careful about how you formulate with it. It needs to be dissolved in ethanol and water before it's added to your final formulation. and it needs a chelating agent to remain stable. It also needs a very tight pH range between 5 and 7, so you will generally need a sodium citrate buffer to hold it tight within this pH range over time, otherwise you simply won't get the efficacy or performance you're hoping for. And a derivative of kojic acid is kojic acid dipalmitate. Now this is an oil-soluble form of a kojic acid derivative. Because it's actually a derivative and it's oil soluble, it doesn't have the same sort of irritancy risks as plain kojic acid, but you won't get the same type of performance either. It is still a very effective skin whitening agent, it just simply doesn't have quite the same performance, but definitely a much safer ingredient to use. You would generally use it between 1 to 5% in your formula, and while there's no regulatory restrictions in place at the moment, please always check with these types of materials. And because it's oil soluble, it's not affected by pH, so it's not sensitive to pH either, which means you could use it in various other formulations if you can hold them stable where a lower pH is required, and it won't impact the performance of this ingredient. The final acid I'm going to go through today is tranexamic acid. Now this is relatively new to the cosmetic space, and it's really great at whitening and lightening the skin, especially scars and darker spots. Now this is not an exfoliating acid, but it still has its fantastic whitening benefits. It would generally be used between 0.5 to 2% for regular use and from 2 to 5% for high use. There are currently no regulatory restrictions for this material, but again, always check with your local regulations. And while it's readily water soluble, so will go into your formulation easily, it requires a pH between 7 to 8 to be stable. So I'd recommend a sodium citrate buffer with this material to hold your formula at that pH over its shelf life for the best performance and stability results. Now it's really important whenever you're using any sort of exfoliating or whitening agents that you also have directions on your packaging, whether required by regulators or not, that the user should use sunscreen. When you are exfoliating or whitening the skin, you are going to remove some of the protective effects of the body's natural melanin pigment, and this means the user is then more susceptible to the dangers of the sun. So there should always be directions or warnings about using sunscreen on these types of products to get the best results and ensure safety of your consumer. Now it's also really important, as you've heard me mention throughout this video, that different types of acids or materials have very specific pH requirements. So when you're formulating with these acids, you'll need to consider what other emulsifiers, surfactants, and gums or polymers you're using to make sure you have a safe, stable, and effective product over the entire shelf life of that product. Just remember, there is no point over neutralizing your acid to bring it back to a more skin compatible pH if the acid requires a low pH. And in some regions, the regulatory requirements might require that you bring the pH up to a point where your acid is no longer effective. In those instances, I would recommend you use a different acid that doesn't have the same regulatory restrictions, because your acids just won't work if they're not at the best biocompatible pH that I've gone through in this video. Similarly, if you use the wrong types of emulsifiers or gums or polymers with your acid, you simply won't get a very good shelf life for your product. The acid may come out as granules in the formula, you may have complete separation, or the viscosity of your formula may be lost within weeks or months. So again, when formulating with acids, make sure you're selecting all other ingredients to be compatible with the final pH requirements of the formula, and use a sodium citrate buffer if you need to hold your pH within a very tight range. Now, formulating with acids is not as easy as simply knowing how to add them, the inputs, or the final pH required, because you need to stabilize those formulas as well. We of course provide professional training to enable you to prepare safe, stable, and efficacious formulas. Just contact us for this summary table and to learn more about our training so that you can get formulating with acids confidently and comply with your local regulations. We teach you how to conduct those searches as well, all over the world, and particularly important in the region where you'll be selling the product. Finally, as I mentioned earlier in this video, simply adding more acid is not necessarily better for the product. It can cause big stability or irritancy issues. You're better off focusing on the performance results you're aiming for and the target market that you're creating the product for, and then picking the best acid for those results. As mentioned, they are quite hard to stabilize, so you're better off picking 1 or 2 acids to really get the job done for your target market and make sure you have a beautiful product that is also safe for them to use. So there you go, there's a summary of the cosmetic acids available, how to add them into formulas, and the pH that they're most stable in and the performance benefits they can provide. I hope you found this summary useful. Please give the video a thumbs up, please leave any questions or comments below, and make sure you subscribe to receive notifications about all our videos. Happy formulating!